Welcome everybody to week number 10 in our 19-week series. So we are over halfway there. Isn't this exciting? Yes, I'm excited. This will go to the end of June, by the way. It's all been worked out, so this series will end on the last, near the end of June. So let's remind ourselves of what we're talking about here. I'm going to go through every time we begin, I'm going to begin with the same thing. The genre, the literary style of a gospel, remember, is a mix. It's a hybrid between a first century Greco-Roman biography and a sermon about Jesus. It's a combination of those two things, the hybrid of those two genres of literature. Remember, in a first century Greco-Roman biography, it was the theme of a famous person's life. And you didn't have to put things in chronological order. You could move them around to fit the theme. But they were all true, but you could move it around a bit to all just rally around or support the theme that you had regarding this famous individual whose biography you were writing. The author we're going with John, the son of Zebedee, one of the 12 disciples, 12 apostles, who wrote the Gospel of John, also wrote 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and the book of Revelation as well, which we've studied verse by verse in this class also. Now the context, if you remember, we broke it down the very first, week number 1, we laid out a possible roadmap for the Gospel of John. And we said, first it began with the prologue. That's where you, as a reader, are getting some inside information, some background information about this individual, about what's about to take place. And that was found John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. John 1:14, and the Word became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us. So right away as a reader, you know more than all the people who you're reading about. You have inside information about who this Jesus truly is and what's truly happening. And so it began with the prologue, and then there was the prelude. That's where we learned about John the Baptist and his involvement in Jesus' ministry. And then was the section known as the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. And that's where we saw where he called his first disciples and performed his first miracle and had his first interactions with the public, particularly with the religious figures. And then we moved into the fourth area that we called the confessions of the Son of God. And that's what we've been working through for the last few weeks. And today will be the last installment in that fourth area of the confessions of the Son of God. And that's the section in the gospel where through his words and his deeds, Jesus is slowly and gradually revealing and unveiling who he is and why he has come to earth. And as I said, today's the last installment of this confession stage before we move into next week, Lord willing, into the stage known as the controversy over the Son of God, where things heat up and escalate. We can start to feel the tension already building, and you'll see it even more today. So we pick it up in John chapter 7, where there's a private display of suspicion against Jesus. And as your outline says, number 1 is John sets the scene. John sets the scene, reading verses 1 and 2 of chapter 7. After this, so meaning after Jesus just had his discussion, remember many people left after the end of chapter 6 because he was making some declarations about unless you eat his flesh and drink his blood, you have no part in him. A lot of people saying, whoa, this is a hard truth. After this, Jesus went around in Galilee. He didn't want to go about in Judea because the Jewish leaders were looking for a way to kill him. But when the Jewish festival of tabernacles was near, let's stop there. So as your outline says, Jesus remains in the north due to the increasing level of resistance in the south. So he remains in the north. So let's again draw a quick map. Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea. Jerusalem was right about here, and Capernaum, his home base, was right about there. And so Jesus has been in here in the Galilee region. That's where he has been. And Judea is sort of this region here in the south. Okay? And so he remains up in the north due to the increasing resistance down in the south. This is where all the religious leaders are. They hover around the home base of Jerusalem. And letter B, it was nearing the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. It was nearing the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. So what's the Feast of Tabernacles? Closest for us would be maybe Thanksgiving, Okay, but as your outline says, it's just a box, there's no blanks here. Literally, it means the Feast of Tents. Tabernacle is another word for tent. Feast of Tents. This was perhaps the most popular of the Jewish holidays, taking place during the fall season. It was a week of celebrating a couple things: God's harvest provision, with ceremonies in the temple, as well as reminders of God's deliverance from Egyptian bondage. That's what it was all about. Remember when we were delivered from Egypt and we traveled around and we lived in tents and dwellings because God had delivered us from Egypt? Remember that? It's a way of reminding themselves of that historical event. Everyone was called to build and live in a temporary shelter or tent. So during this feast, it was sort of a fun thing for a family. You didn't live in your house, you lived in a tent outside of your house. Or, you'd make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem and they'd live in tents outside of Jerusalem. It was a camping trip is what it was. And over the years, the festival gained an emphasis of looking forward to the future deliverer as well. So it wasn't so much looking at the past deliverance, but it also looked forward to a future Messiah coming as well. Now, number 2 on your outline, Jesus' younger and unbelieving brothers taunt him. They make fun of him. They taunt him. Let's read verses 3 to 5. Jesus' brothers said to him, "Leave Galilee and go up to Judea." Now you say, why do they say going up to Judea? Remember this? It's south, so why are they saying going up? Because it's south by the way of the compass, but it's up by way of climbing. So this is lower. This is below sea level, Sea of Galilee, and this is above sea level. So you're climbing up to Jerusalem. So they always talk about going up to Jerusalem. It says, "Leave Galilee and go to Judea, so that your disciples there may see the works that you do. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. Since you're doing these things, show yourself to the world." For even his own brothers did not believe him. Even his own brothers didn't believe in him. So, what they're saying is, don't hang up here in Galilee. Go to Judea. Go to Jerusalem. That's where all the action is. If you're going to be this big religious guru, go there. That's where all the religious gurus are. As your outline says, they're likely responding to Jesus being abandoned by some of his followers. So they're kind of leaning in. When your things aren't going well for a team, people jump off the bandwagon, start making fun, poking. That's kind of what's happening to Jesus here. His brothers are going, "Oh, you had all these followers a while ago. Now you don't have as many followers. What's going on?" They're making fun of him. And they're essentially saying, as your outline says, to be, Jerusalem will be overflowing with religious people. You should be there. Jerusalem be overflowing. You should be there. It's the Feast of Tabernacles. Everyone's there. That's where you should be. And letter C, they accuse Jesus of being an attention seeker. They're essentially accusing him of being an attention seeker. Listen, anyone who wants to become a public figure, like you apparently do, you want to be so famous and popular. So anyone who wants to be a public figure, you should be going down where the crowds are. Go to the big city, Jesus. Don't be hanging up here in the boondocks where all the hicks are and the hillbillies in Galilee. Head down to Jerusalem if you're such a big shot. That's what they're saying. Number 3, Jesus rejects their travel advice. He rejects their travel advice. Starting at verse 6. Therefore, Jesus told them, "My time is not yet here. For you, any time will do. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify that its works are evil. You go to the festival. I'm not going up to this festival because my time has not yet fully come." After he had said this, he stayed in Galilee. Now, there are 2 main words, key words for time in the ancient Greek language. There's the word chronos, where we get our word chronology. That's for time in general, Where does time go? Where does chronos go is what you're saying. It's the passage of moments in time. As I said, it's where we get our word chronological, in order of time. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. That's chronos time, okay? Just time in general. But then there's the word kairos. And that's the word that's used here. As your outline says, kairos is the word for an appointed or scheduled time. It's the word for an appointed time, a scheduled time. Okay? It's a specific. When you have an appointment, a time you're supposed to be at the doctor's, that's a kairos. That's not a chronos moment. That's a kairos moment. It's a scheduled, appointed time. So with that in mind, you see what he's saying. Jesus said, my kairos is not yet here. My appointed time, for you, any time will do. The world can't hate you, but it hates me because I testify that its works are evil. So Jesus is saying, as your outline says, people who are detached from the Father's presence are not attached to the Father's timeline. That's a profound statement right there. That should be a big idea right there. People who are detached from the Father's presence are not attached to the Father's timeline. That's what he's saying here. Verse 8 and 9, you go to the festival. I'm not going up to this festival because my time, my kairos, has not yet fully come. After he had said this, he stayed in Galilee. Now, notice, I'm sure many of you have a little notation there, and at the bottom of your page, it says not yet, right? Many of you. When it has the word, my time is, I am not. Verse 8, I am not. And many versions, if not most, if not all, will say not, could also say not yet, right? That's because that's what that word is sort of a either or sign of sort of a thing. Some manuscripts say Jesus said, I am not yet going to the festival. Okay? So as your outline says, Jesus is not saying, I will never go to the festival. Jesus is saying, the time is not yet right for me to go to the festival. He's not saying, I will never go to the festival. He's saying, the time is not yet right for me to go. He said, you go. For you, any time is right for you to go. For me, it's not my appointed time to head there yet. You go ahead. Go without me. Okay? He's not saying I'm never going to be there. He's simply saying it's not time for me to go yet. Number 4, Jesus eventually heads up to an increasingly hostile Jerusalem. He eventually heads up to an increasingly hostile Jerusalem. Verses 10 to 13. However, after his brothers had left for the festival, he went also, not publicly, but in secret. Now, at the festival, the Jewish leaders were watching for Jesus and asking, where is he? Among the crowds, there was widespread whispering about him. Some said, he's a good man. Others replied, no, he deceives the people. But no one would say anything publicly about him for fear of the leaders. So, John's informing his readers that the tension surrounding the life and ministry of Jesus is increasing. And then we move from a private display of suspicion to a public display of rejection. Number 1, B1 in your outline, the authority of Jesus is discussed. So the authority of Jesus is discussed. Let's read a big chunk here, verses 14 to verse 24. Now, not until halfway through the festival did Jesus go up to the temple courts and begin to teach. The Jews there were amazed and asked, how did this man get such learning without having been taught? Jesus answered, my teaching is not my own. It comes from the one who sent me. Anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. Whoever speaks on their own does so to gain personal glory. But he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is a man of faith. A man of truth, I should say. There is nothing false about him. Has not Moses given you the law, yet not one of you keeps the law? So why are you trying to kill me? You're demon-possessed, the crowd answered. Who's trying to kill you? Jesus said to them, I did one miracle and you're all amazed. Yet because Moses gave you circumcision, though actually it didn't come from Moses, but from the patriarchs, you circumcised a boy on the Sabbath. Now, if a boy can be circumcised on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses may not be broken, why are you angry with me for healing a man's whole body on the Sabbath? Stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly. Now, this is genius what he says here. Understand the context of this statement, first of all. The best and the brightest young students at that time would be sent off to live with and study under a well-respected rabbi. They would literally be the disciples of that rabbi. That's how Jesus and his followers would have been perceived by the masses. Jesus is the rabbi, they're all his followers. That was common then. So the religious authorities are no doubt saying, he didn't attend a famous rabbinical school or study under a famous rabbi, so how did he get so much knowledge? That's what they're asking. It'd be like today, she didn't go to university. How did she get to be so smart? That's kind of what they're saying. Jesus responds by revealing his source of knowledge. He says, I didn't just make this stuff up. Neither is it from a long line of scholars that I've learned it. It's obvious to anyone who lives and seeks the truth that my teaching comes directly from the one who sent me, from God himself. So Jesus is, with the Moses comment there, he tells them that their failure to keep the law and their zeal to kill him proves that they're not seekers of or motivated by the truth. You know, if you're really so zealous for the truth, why don't you follow the law of Moses? And why are you trying to kill me? That's what he's saying here. The letter B in your outline, the authority of Jesus' miracles is explained. The authority of his miracles is explained in part of here. Let's reread verses 20 to 24. You're demon-possessed, they said. Who's trying to kill you? Jesus said, I did one miracle and you're all amazed. Yet because Moses gave you circumcision, though actually it didn't come from Moses, but from the patriarchs, you circumcised a boy on the Sabbath. Now, if a boy can be circumcised on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses may not be broken, why are you angry with me for healing a man's whole body on the Sabbath? Stop judging by mere appearances. Instead, judge correctly. Jesus is saying here, you are all, as your outline says, you are all stirred up because months ago at the pool of Bethesda, I healed a man on the Sabbath. Remember that? We studied that a few weeks ago. Saying that you're all stirred up because of that. It's driven you crazy, you leaders, because of that ever since. He says, as your outline says, you yourselves recognize exceptions when it comes to the Sabbath rules. Be consistent. You yourselves recognize their exceptions when it comes to breaking Sabbath rules. Be consistent. They made an exception that if, 8 days after you're born, a little boy's born, you have to be circumcised. Well, if that day of circumcision falls on a Sabbath, you could do it. Even though it's strictly speaking considered work, that's okay to do it on the Sabbath so that God's design may be fulfilled. Well, what Jesus is saying is, and to me this is genius, he says, if circumcising a boy on the Sabbath is allowed as an exception to the work law, because you see it as aligning one part of that child's body with God's design, how is healing a person on the Sabbath not allowed as an exception to the work law, since it's aligning the entire body with God's design? It's genius. Circumcising a child's penis is seen aligning that little child's body with God's design. You allow that on the Sabbath. Well, how is not healing an entire body on the Sabbath aligning that entire body with God's design? You allow it for one part, why won't you allow it for the whole body? Stop judging things incorrectly. Be consistent is what he's saying. Absolute genius. Number 2, the identity of Jesus is debated. Then the identity of Jesus is debated, starting at verse 25. At that point, some of the people of Jerusalem began to ask, isn't this the man they're trying to kill? Here he is, speaking publicly, and they're not saying a word to him. Have the authorities really concluded that he is the Messiah? Well, as your outline says, 2a, the silence of the authorities in response to Jesus' boldness confuses people. The silence confuses people. Why are they not saying anything? Why are they letting him talk publicly? I thought they were against him. And letter B, 2b, belief in a popular messianic legend confuses people also. Belief in a popular messianic legend confuses people. We see that in verse 27. But we know where this man is from. When the Messiah comes, no one will know where he's from. Now, what's that all about? A common view held at that time was that the Messiah would be born a natural flesh and blood man. However, he would be completely unknown and hidden for his entire life until he suddenly appears on the scene, seemingly out of nowhere, and takes his rightful place as the Messiah. That was the belief amongst some. And some of them were saying, we don't know all about this guy's childhood. He's from Nazareth. We know his family, so he can't be the Messiah because we know where he's from. That's what some were saying. Well, letter C in your outline, Jesus directly addresses the confusion. He directly addresses the confusion, verses 28 and 29. Then Jesus, still teaching in the temple courts, cried out, yes, you know me and you know where I'm from. I'm not here on my own authority, but he who sent me is true. You don't know him. But I know him because I am from him and he sent me. So Jesus is saying, you think you know where I'm from, but you don't know as much as you think. And letter D on your outline, the frustration and confusion continues. The frustration and the confusion continues. Look at verses 30 to 32. At this, they tried to seize him, but no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. The word hour there in Greek means his definite moment. His hour had not yet come. Still, many in the crowd believed in him. They said, when the Messiah comes, will he perform more signs than this man? The Pharisees heard the crowd whispering such things about him. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees sent temple guards to arrest him. Now, as your outline says, letter E, once again, Jesus' words are misunderstood by the masses. Once again, they misunderstand his words. Look at verses 33 to 36. Jesus said, I am with you for only a short time. Then I'm going to the one who sent me. You'll look for me, but you're not going to find me, and where I am, you can't come. The Jews said to one another, where does this man intend to go that we can't find him? Will he go where our people live, scattered among the Greeks? So is he going to go off to the Gentiles? Is he going to go to Rome, Athens? That's what they're asking. And teach the Greeks? What did he mean when he said, you'll look for me, but you will not find me, and where I am, you cannot come? So Jesus is referring to his soon return to the presence of the Father, to the heavenly realm. But they didn't know that. They misunderstood what he was saying. Number 3 in your outline. A promise from Jesus is declared. Then a promise from Jesus is declared. And 3A on your outline. Jesus uses the water metaphor from that day's ceremony. He uses the water metaphor from that day's ceremony. Here's an example again. If we don't know the context and the culture of the day, we miss the depth of what Jesus is saying here. It says, verse 37, on the last and greatest day of the festival. The last and greatest day of the festival. What's that? That's John. He's writing code. His readers, who are Jews, would understand this. See, at the end of the Feast of Tabernacles, a golden container was filled with water from the pool of Siloam. So the temple would be up here, and south of it was a pool of Siloam. Next time you come to Israel with me, we go to the pool of Siloam every time. And then there's a road that we'll walk up, and it takes you to the foot of the Temple Mount, and there'd be a big procession. So here's the pool of Siloam. That was this ceremonial washing pool. By the way, they've just excavated this even more, and it's a whole big, massive pool that is being excavated. I can't wait to get back to see what they've discovered here. But so the pool of Siloam, it would start there. And they would, in these gold containers, the chief priests would get some water in them, and then they would have this procession marching up. It was a parade is what it was, up the highway there to the, which is just, it takes 10 minutes to walk there, up to the Temple Mount. And they'd carry it up the hill to the temple in a grand procession led by the high priest. And as the procession approached the gate to the inner court of the temple, 3 blasts from a shofar was sounded, a trumpet that's connected to joyful occasions. And while the people watched from a distance, the priest circled around the altar with a jar of water, and the choir singing praises to God. The choir would be singing from Psalm 118, and the crowd would wave branches and shout, give thanks to the Lord, give thanks to the Lord. It was a party. And the priests would then pour the offering of wine and water before the Lord on the altar, signifying God's provision of water in the desert, and God's promise to pour out his Spirit in the last days. That's what it all signified. It was a huge celebration, and it was the culmination of this great festival, this big party. With that as the context, now let's read what Jesus said, verses 37 to 39. It says, on the last and greatest day of the festival, when all this took place, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, let anyone who's thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them. By this he meant the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were later to receive. Up till that time, the Spirit had not been given, since Jesus had not yet been glorified. So Jesus is claiming to be the source of salvation and the source of the Spirit of God. As your outline says, letter B, the confusion and the tension increase all the more. The confusion and the tension increase all the more. Pick it up at verse 40. On hearing his words, some of the people said, surely this man is the prophet. Others said, no, he's the Messiah. Remember we learned a while ago, there was three figures they were expecting. The prophet, like Moses, the Messiah, who was like a political ruler, and Elijah. Elijah was to return, Elijah like prophet, remember? And so that's what some of those are saying. Surely this man is the prophet we've been expecting, like Moses. Others said, no, he's the Messiah. Still others asked, how can the Messiah come from Galilee? Doesn't Scripture say that the Messiah will come from David's descendants and from Bethlehem, the town where David lived? Thus the people were divided because of Jesus. Some wanted to seize him, but no one laid a hand on him. Bethlehem was right here, right beside Jerusalem. And they said, he's up from Nazareth. He can't be the Messiah. He's from Nazareth, right? That's what they're saying to themselves. All right, let's keep reading. Verse 45. Finally, the temple guards went back to the chief priests and the Pharisees, who asked them, why didn't you bring him in? No one ever spoke the way this man does, the guards replied. You mean he's deceived you also, the Pharisees retorted? Have any of the rulers or of the Pharisees believed in him? No, but this mob that knows nothing of the law, there's a curse on them. Nicodemus, who had gone to Jesus earlier and who was one of their own number, asked, well, does our law condemn a man without first hearing him to find out what he's been doing? They replied, are you from Galilee too? Look into it, and you'll find that a prophet doesn't come out of Galilee. So you can see this tension is rising. And then there's a public attempt at entrapment. Now, let's get into it. How many people in your Bibles, the next passage is in italics or there's a notation with it? Yeah? Raise your hand if that's true as you look at your Bible. Yeah, pretty well all the Bibles. Here's the thing. Our Bibles are, and it'll say that, this next verses 1 to 11 or 53, I think, 753 to 811 or 12 will say that those are not in the original manuscripts. What's that all about? Our Bibles are based on collections of thousands of ancient manuscripts, documents that are continually being discovered and added to the collection. The oldest and most reliable manuscripts don't contain 8, 1 to 11. Now, it's not doubted that the event recorded in the passage took place. They're not doubting that it took place. It simply wasn't included in the earliest copies of John's Gospel. By the way, after I'm going to be finished the Gospel of John at the end of June, and then starting in September, I'm going to do, I think it's 6 or 7 week course, revisit a course I taught many years ago here at Broadway called, it's basically How We Got Our Bible. And we are going to answer all these questions. So how did we get the Bible? How did we get the Old Testament? How did we get the New Testament? How do we know it's God's Word? What does inerrant mean? What does inspired mean? What do we do if we find mistakes in the Bible? Does that mean that we throw it all out? How can we trust the Bible? We are going to study all of that in that series that we're going to do starting in September. So hold those questions for later. Suffice it to say, that the ancient manuscripts, the most reliable manuscripts, don't have this passage as part of it. Some of them, other manuscripts, have it in different places and portions of it, but the earliest, most reliable ones don't include it. So they're saying somehow it got added later on by some scribes. Having said that, regardless, we're going to study it today. Number 1 on your outline, John sets the scene again. John sets the scene. It says, they all went home. So after Jesus had this encounter at the temple, they all went home, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. So essentially what this is the temple on the temple, and this is the Pool of Siloam down here, and this is the Kidron Valley and the Hinnom Valley, and this is the Mount of Olives. And Gethsemane is on the Mount of Olives here, okay? And so Jesus, they're saying, he went across the Kidron Valley, probably up in Gethsemane, because that's where he liked to spend a lot of time. So that's essentially what's happening, that Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. And then at dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him and sat down to teach them. So it looks like he spent the evening on the Mount of Olives, maybe in Gethsemane, where he liked to pray. Then the next morning he goes back over, and that is like a 15-minute walk. Back over, and he goes into the temple courts, is what he did. All right. As your outline says, number 2, Some religious leaders publicly present Jesus with a situation, seeking his opinion. They present him with a situation, seeking his opinion. Let's read verses 3 to 5. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. Think about that. Caught in adultery. So caught in the act is the implication. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught," well, there you go, literally, caught in the act of adultery. Okay? "In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now, what do you say?" Now, as your outline says, 2a, the details scream unjust. The details are screaming unjust. Where are the witnesses? Where's the male? If she's caught in the act, where's the guy? So this doesn't pass the smell test, right? Number 3 in your outline, John informs the readers that this is a trap. This is a trap. Look at beginning of verse 6 in chapter 8. They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. So what's the trap? Well, as your outline says, 3a, if Jesus ignores the law of Moses and sets her free, his credibility is undermined. If he just ignores the law of Moses and sets her free, his credibility is undermined. B, if Jesus upholds the law of Moses and signs off on her death, his compassionate reputation with the crowds is undermined, and he's in trouble with the Roman prefect, who alone had the authority of life and death at that time. So, either way, they think they've got him caught. Ignore the law of Moses and set her free, you're in trouble. How dare you? Hold up the law of Moses and have her put to death. Well, the Romans are going to be furious because you don't have the right to have her put to death. And all the crowd's going to say, but I thought he was a nice guy. So, Jesus, as your outline says, number 4, Jesus responds. Jesus responds. Let's pick it up, second part of verse 6. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Now, the use of the word write and finger are subtle, but scholars think clear allusions to Exodus 31:18, where it's alluding to the law. And you can look it up, the law of God and the tablets being written by the finger of God. And the tablets. God wrote the law by his own finger, if you will. So as your outline says, 4b, John seems to be communicating that Jesus is the one who wrote the law, so Jesus can do what he wants with the law. He's the one who wrote it, so he can do what he wants with it. Seems to be the illusion. Now, the witnesses in Deuteronomy 13, Jesus alludes to Deuteronomy 13:9 and 17:7, where it talks about the witnesses of a crime must be the first to throw the stones of judgment, but they can't be participants in the crime themselves. So if you witness a crime, you have to be the first one. You testified as a witness. You have to be the first one to throw the stones in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy. But you can't be a witness and a participant as well and throw stones. The implication seems to be that Jesus knew, and this is all implication, it's full of mystery here, that Jesus seemed to know that these men had incidents of sexual sin in their own lives. And I've read all sorts of different scholars who say, what did he write down on the ground? Whatever it was seems to have freaked these guys out. So did he write the names of past sexual partners that they had? Or incidents that only they would know? Oh, how did he know that name? And they're looking, that's aimed at me. How did he know about that? Who knows what he wrote? But he wrote a couple times, and it seems to be for no reason. I don't think he was doodling. He wrote something, we don't know what he wrote, and John didn't want us to know what he wrote. But whatever it was, it had its effect upon them, okay? Letter D, Jesus does not forbid them from carrying out the judgment. He simply qualifies the moral character of the one who will actually do it. So he doesn't forbid them from carrying out the judgment. He just qualifies the moral character of the one who's actually going to carry out the judgment. So Jesus isn't stating that a judge has to have moral perfection. He's simply stating that a judge can't be guilty of the same crime. That's what's happening here. So as your outline says, number 5, the accusers eventually depart. Read verse 9. At this referring to he stooped to the ground and wrote. So he wrote something that spooked them. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. And as your outline says, number 6, Jesus extends mercy in the present and calls for a life change in the future. He extends mercy in the present and calls for a life change in the future. Verses 10 and 11. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." In other words, he says, move on in your life. Don't get stuck here. Don't get stuck in the guilt and shame. Move on. Next, we'll stop there today. Next week, we're going to move into the controversy of the Son of God section. And we're going to step into a major public debate next week where Jesus actually tells his opponents they are children of the devil. You know, gentle Jesus, meek and mild. That's what he's going to say next week.